All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. The name of this session is Go Away and Leave Me Alone, Data Protection and the History of Privacy. This session will outline the history of privacy as the most human of human rights, explain why data privacy is the right to privacy's most logical next iteration, and examine the ways in which data protection laws and strong data protection programs represent the next frontier in human rights, promotion and protection. We'll have some time at the end of the session to address questions, but please feel free to put them in the comments beforehand. Our speaker for this session is Bethany Singer-Bayofsky. Bethany is a Global Chief Privacy Officer at National Grid. Bethany is a Fellow of Information Privacy and has certifications from the International Association of Privacy Professionals in the US, European, Canadian, and Asian privacy law, as well as privacy program management and privacy technology. She has collaborated closely with the most major privacy technology providers and has built, implemented, and socialized data classification systems, developed privacy training programs, and regularly addresses audiences across industries and specializations on privacy best practices and building a culture of privacy by design. And with that, I'll hand it off to Bethany.
Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you everyone for being here today. As Matt said, please do drop questions in the chat as we go, and we'll be able to address those at the end. So now that all of the administrative stuff is out of the way, we're going to begin today with a quote. We're gonna slide, come on, slide. There we go. Privacy is not something that I'm merely entitled to. It's an absolute prerequisite. Now, I want you to think for a moment about who said this. Don't Google, or you'll ruin the surprise. But just think about who said this. Maybe someone like Edward Snowden. Maybe this was, somebody blowing the whistle at a big tech company. Maybe a government regulator. Any of those would be fantastic guesses. But you might be surprised to learn that this was said by Marlon Brando, the great Marlon Brando, in 1960. That was decades before social media, before deep fakes, before AI algorithms and targeted ads. And what this tells us is that no matter the era or the profession, for many people and throughout all of time, privacy concerns have been top of mind. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, dramatic social, political, and technological changes have influenced how we understand the human right to privacy. From the invention of the camera through ever-advancing AI and machine learning tools, as humanity has developed new and innovative ways to interpret, engage with, and influence our world, we have been consistently left with big questions about what this all means for ourselves and for society at large. None of this is new. What is new is the influx of data privacy laws around the world and the focus on data specifically as a threat to privacy rights generally. How we arrived at this point, however, is an ancient and fundamentally human story. So let us begin by stepping far, far back in time, before agriculture, before city-states, when human beings lived hunter-gatherer existences. Seclusion meant death. If you became separated from your group, you risked the elements, starvation, becoming another animal's meal. The advent of agriculture fundamentally changed that. As long as you had crops, you knew where your next meal was coming from, and that meant you could go for a walk by yourself and be reasonably certain that A, you wouldn't starve, and B, your home would still be there when you returned. On a deeply practical, even primal level, that is the origin of privacy. But leaping forward in time, I'm sure nobody will be shocked to discover that privacy's conceptual origins reside in ancient Greece. Now, very simply, our friend Aristotle distinguished between oikos, the family or private life, and polis, the public or civic and political life. Each of these served a different purpose and was valued in different ways. Ancient notions of privacy were not rights-based. Aristotle's discussion on the public versus the private spheres were components of various thought exercises on human nature and on what constitutes a virtuous society. It took many more centuries for the concept of rights as we understand them today to enter the mainstream, including the right to privacy. The Middle Ages, which was hardly a human rights hotbed, ushered in an era of mandatory private confession. The prevailing belief at the time was that sin existed both in thought and in action, and the way to purge oneself of sin was to withdraw into a state of private prayer and repentance. Privacy was not a right, it was a moral imperative. That said, today's notions of data ownership, of preventing powerful entities, whether governments or technology giants, from accessing our data without our knowledge or consent, can also be traced to the Middle Ages. In 1215, the Magna Carta prohibited the king from arbitrarily seizing private property. And while, of course, given the time, this referred solely to the physical property of white male landowners, when we speak today of owning our data, that idea stems from the notion introduced in the Magna Carta that we possess an individual right to private property entitled to protection from those more powerful than ourselves. It is the Enlightenment, however, where we find the beginnings of our more modern understanding of the individual rights and the human right to privacy. Enlightenment thinkers were the primary authors of natural rights philosophy, the idea that individuals were born with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, and that it is the role of governments to safeguard and secure those rights. This philosophy found its way into the United States Constitution. And while the right to privacy is not explicitly delineated, it is implied in the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments, has been asserted in legal scholarship for over 100 years and upheld by the Supreme Court in such cases as Griswold versus Connecticut, Katz versus United States, and Lawrence versus Texas, among others. Now, despite being the home of ancient Greece and the wellspring of Enlightenment thought, much of 20th century Europe, as we all know, descended into autocracy or had it forced upon them. There is no privacy in tyranny, and whether it was precise Nazi record keeping that paved the way to mass slaughter, the East German Stasi's ever-present surveillance machine, or decades of KGB abuses across the Soviet Union, these autocratic regimes learned that the most effective way to dehumanize is to strip people of their privacy. And let's be clear, privacy violations in this context were not limited to hidden microphones, lists of names, and snitching neighbors. Freedom of expression cannot exist without the right to one's own private thoughts. Responding to state criticism with violence is as much a privacy violation as is the secret police bugging a house. Now, the United States as well was not immune to committing horrifying privacy violations and other human rights abuses during World War II and the Cold War. Internment camps for Japanese Americans, the McCarthy hearings, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the wiretapping of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders in the name of national security are a mere handful of examples. The brutality of these decades illustrated a profound need for strong, globally enforceable human rights protections that included the right to privacy. To that end, In 1945, the new United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 12 of which asserts the individual right to privacy. Though the declaration was non-binding, in 1966, the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a treaty that was and remains legally binding on all signatories, enshrined the right to privacy in Article 17. In the year 2000, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights explicitly guaranteed the right to privacy in Article 7, with the right to freedom of thought and both public and private expression of belief protected in Article 10. In the decades since, laws, regulations, and treaties have continued to codify these rights. With treaties like the ICCPR guaranteeing the right to privacy, sovereign states made enforceable commitments between themselves for global oversight over internal policies and practices. This was revolutionary. The ICCPR is one of the foundational pillars of international human rights law. Prior to the existence of this branch of international law, public international law as a whole existed to regulate relations between countries, not within them, and not within them in terms of being between a sovereign state and their own people. Now, what international human rights law did for states enshrined the obligation to promote and protect the rights of their own people through internal policies and practices. Data privacy and data protection laws are doing for companies. To be clear, labor and employment law, corporate social responsibility rules, anti-slavery and ethical supply chain regulations, and pay equity requirements, among other laws, regulations, and codes, fall under this corporate human rights umbrella. It is not unique to privacy. However, as the lines between the virtual and physical world continue to blur, as we live more and more of our lives online, the promotion and protection of the human right to privacy specifically is becoming a private sector responsibility in ways we haven't seen before. So just as international human rights law created global oversight for a nation state's internal policies and practices, so are data privacy and data protection laws creating national and regional oversight for an organization's internal laws and practice, internal policies and practices. Now, it is important to pause here for a moment and define data privacy versus data protection. Data privacy refers to an individual's right to understand and, where legally and technically possible, exercise control over the data an organization collects from or about them. Data protection in a privacy context refers to the obligations organizations have to protect the personal data in their possession. In other words, data protection is how an organization promotes and protects their customers, employees, visitors, contractors' rights to data privacy. To that end, as video, audio, surveillance, and of course, computing and digital technologies have rapidly advanced, data privacy has become a new regulatory frontier. In 1981, the Council of Europe adopted Convention 108, the first international instrument designed to regulate the collection and processing of personal data. The treaty defined personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable individual, and prohibited the collection of sensitive personal data without appropriate safeguards enshrined into domestic law. Convention 108, which entered into force in 1985, also guaranteed certain individual rights. For example, the right to object to the processing of one's personal data that are considered table stakes in data protection laws today. Now, a mere decade later, The EU adopted the Data Protection Directive, the precursor to the law with which we in this virtual room are surely all quite familiar, the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation. Fun fact, well, nerdy fun fact if you're into that sort of thing, in 2018, the same year that the GDPR entered into force, Convention 108 was modernized to better align with the GDPR itself. So suffice it to say, the GDPR was a watershed moment for data privacy. Suddenly, any organization conducting business in the EU needed to reassess, and many assess for the first time, their internal data practices. Instead of an asset that a company could use as they see fit, organizations needed to consider data in terms of liability and risk. But even this particular risk calculation was novel to many. Unlike traditional risk calculations of the likelihood that an adverse event occurs multiplied by its probable impact on the organization, assessing privacy risk requires an additional impact metric: the impact on the human rights of the data subject. If the personal data itself is sensitive, if its loss or unauthorized disclosure risk the health, life, livelihood, or reputation of the individual from or about whom it is collected, the potential for an adverse impact on the organization increases. Even prior to the GDPR, Canada had and still has an equivalent metric, the RROSH standard, or Real Risk of Significant Harm, RRSH. It was GDPR, however, that necessitated this approach on a truly global scale. And not a moment too soon. I'm going to share with you a passage from the Electronic Frontier Foundation's report, Behind the One-Way Mirror. Trackers are hiding in nearly every corner of today's internet, which is to say, nearly every corner of modern life. The average web page shares data with dozens of third parties. The average mobile app does the same, and many apps collect highly sensitive information like location and call records, even when they're not in use. Tracking also reaches into the physical world. Shopping centers use automatic license plate readers to track traffic through their parking lots, then share that data with law enforcement. Businesses, concert organizers, and political campaigns use Bluetooth and Wi-Fi beacons to perform passive monitoring of people in their area. Retail stores use face recognition to identify customers, screen for theft, and deliver targeted ads. The tech companies, data brokers, and advertisers behind this surveillance and the technology that drives it are largely invisible to the average user. Corporations have built a hall of one-way mirrors. From the inside, you can only see apps, web pages, ads, and yourself reflected by social media. But in the shadows behind the glass, trackers quietly take notes on nearly everything you do. These trackers are not omniscient, but they are widespread and indiscriminate. The data they collect and derive is not perfect, but it is nevertheless extremely sensitive. Now, this report was published in December of 2019. In the 3.5 years since, we have seen the immense power of data as product, data as capital, only increase. According to Axios, in 2020, the combined revenue of Meta, Apple, Alphabet, and Amazon was $773 billion, or roughly the GDP of Saudi Arabia. Per MarketWatch, in 2022, those four companies plus Microsoft raked in combined revenues of nearly $1.5 trillion. Yes, that is trillion with a T, a 55% increase over 2021. Now, of course, not all of this is due to the monetization of personal data. Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon are also huge names in physical consumer goods. But it is undeniable that the big tech industry has shaped today's internet through, as author and professor Shoshana Zuboff describes it, surveillance capitalism, with tangible effects on our privacy. As new technologies have transformed and continue to transform data from a series of bits, bytes, rosters, and forms into pointillist style paintings of people's lives, it falls on us in the privacy, records management, and information security space to become the next generation of human rights defenders. But how? How do we support product development, marketing, and sales objectives when these teams and their leaders so often see us as cost centers, as obstacles, as the naysaying, rule setting, fun killing teachers' pets who won't let them play with the data? Now, I have worked with technology leaders for a long time. It is not easy to embed a human rights mindset into business operations, but it can be done. And robust, automated, adaptable data protection programs that anticipate changes in privacy laws, embed easily into products, embed easily into business processes, and embed easily into existing workflows, and empower the organization to earn and sustain consumer trust, have the power to transform data privacy from a compliance-driven cost center to a revenue generator where human rights protection actually bolsters the bottom line. And the numbers back this up. Customers are willing to walk away from companies that fail to protect their data privacy rights. According to Cisco's 2023 Data Privacy Benchmark Study, 94% of organizations reported that customers will not buy from them if they fail to protect their data. And fascinatingly, organizations are seeing a return of 1.8 times spending on their privacy programs, with 36% of organizations, up from 32% the previous year, seeing returns of at least twice their spending, and many realizing returns upwards of 3 to 5 times their investment. I will be the first to admit that assigning dollar values to human rights promotion and protection is not exactly sexy, but we need to be realistic. If we want to ensure that when products go to market, the protection of consumer privacy is integral to their functionality, then we also need to acknowledge that these numbers are really promising, very encouraging, and we need to talk about privacy by design. Privacy by design was first conceptualized in 1995 by then Ontario Privacy Commissioner Dr. Anne Cavoukian. It was published as a framework in 2009, and just this past February, the International Standards Organization incorporated its principles into their newest standard, ISO 31700. According to Dr. Cavoukian herself, privacy by design advances the view that the future of privacy cannot be assured solely by compliance with regulatory frameworks. Rather, privacy assurance must ideally become an organization's default mode of operation. In other words, privacy best practices must be injected into a company's DNA. To do this, we need to first identify what those best practices are and what principles they're designed to protect. So first things first, let's go through some of those key principles, all of those key principles that organizations need to bake into their product designs and business operations. When designing for privacy, consent must be kept in mind. Essentially, wherever possible, enable individuals to opt in to personal data collection. Ensure that consent may be withdrawn as easily as it is given. For example, if someone needs only to click a checkbox to opt in to receiving an email newsletter, allow them to opt out via simple click as well. For example, an unsubscribe link. Don't make them call you or, heaven forbid, send a fax Yes, I have seen that, and no, it was not pretty. We want to also consider transparency and notice. We've all seen those tick boxes where we need to confirm that we've read and agreed to a privacy policy. While it is, of course, important to always include a link to a privacy policy, also called a privacy notice, it's critical that these notices become a lot more user friendly than they currently are in most places. But the notices themselves aren't enough. At the time of personal data collection, be explicit with individuals about what data you're collecting and why, how it's being secured, and for how long it will be retained. After all, if you're relying on someone's consent, it really isn't valid if they don't understand what it is that they're consenting to. And if consent isn't appropriate in that moment, for example, you're collecting personal information necessary to fulfill the terms of a contract or for a legal reason, why not just explain that? Next, we want to consider data minimization and purpose limitation. I combine these principles because they're fundamentally connected and pretty self explanatory. Only collect the minimum amount of personal data you need for a given product feature or business purpose, and only use personal data for the business purposes for which it was collected. Regulators from Sacramento to London and beyond are clear. Collecting personal information without a clearly defined, well communicated purpose can no longer be a company or organization's mode of operation. Just last year, the Federal Trade Commission ordered Twitter to pay a $150 million fine for selling to advertisers user telephone numbers collected for account verification purposes. Personal data uses must align with the reasons for their collection, and we mustn't collect more than we need. In terms of access and portability, this one's pretty simple. Organizations must enable users to access the personal data they hold on them and provide a copy upon request in a commonly used machine-readable format. Accuracy and quality are critical principles as well. Organizations must ensure that the personal data they hold is correct and, where possible, allow users to update their data as needed. For many companies, this could be as simple as creating an easy-to-use interface for customers to update their contact details. But the obligation to maintain accurate records, as we all know, is critical. And for organizations processing sensitive data, such as health or financial details, the consequences of falling short on this principle can be dire. Retention and deletion should be pretty self-explanatory as well, and probably quite familiar to this group. Only retain personal data for as long as needed to perform the transparently communicated data processing activities, or as required by law. When legally permissible, enable users to delete their data upon request. In the EU and UK, this is called the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten. And finally, security for privacy. Enact state-of-the-art technical and organizational measures to protect personal data from threats to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This, of course, requires strong partnerships with IT and security teams to implement and enforce. It is this overall implementation and enforcement piece, not just within security or IT, but across the board, that proves challenging. We know that we can wield the regulatory hammer and insist that product development, engineering, and marketing teams do a better job of managing risk because, well, the law said so. But that's frustrating for everyone and does nothing to promote a culture of consumer trust. So this brings us back to privacy by design. We've seen the numbers. Companies that invest in robust privacy programs see a strong return on that investment. The way to get there is by incorporating privacy-enhancing techniques into product development and other business processes by making privacy protections a product feature and weaving privacy processes seamlessly into developer workflows. A privacy by design approach involves privacy teams at the outset, including them from the earliest design phase all the way through launch and eventual sunsetting and data deletion. This enables teams to be proactive rather than reactive, anticipating privacy violations and remedying them before they have the chance to materialize. For example, privacy impact assessments, or PIAs, risk assessments that document business processes or initiatives, the personal data needed to fulfill those purposes, and the mechanisms for protecting that data should be completed as early as possible, ideally well before development work has begun. This allows for teams to embed privacy into design and ensure privacy settings are built in by default. In other words, privacy teams should communicate with program teams that we must be included as a stakeholder in project plans, that our PIAs must be incorporated into existing planning documentation, and that when evaluating usability in design, user privacy preference navigation should be treated the same as any other usability feature. Data privacy requirements are no different from any product, marketing, sales, or UX requests. They must be kept user-centric. This is a positive sum, not a zero-sum game. Protecting privacy does not mean slowing down development or sacrificing functionality. Privacy by design done right is a win-win for all stakeholders. Now, naturally, there has to be a level of oversight. Security teams must be included as equal partners to ensure full personal data lifecycle protection from ingestion through deletion. And of course, trust but verify. Quality assurance teams test software before launch. Marketers test their landing page URLs and advertising tracking pixels. Privacy and data security are simply one more stakeholder whose controls need to be verified. Ensure prior to launch that privacy settings work as documented, including internal access controls and opt-in and opt-out mechanisms. In a Life magazine piece in 1955, the legendary Greta Garbo clarified for the world, "I never said, 'I want to be alone.' I only said I want to be let alone. There is all the difference." Author Anthony Burgess is quoted as saying, "To be left alone is the most precious thing one can ask of the modern world." And the great author and journalist Gabriel Garcia Marquez reflected that all human beings have three lives: public, private, and secret. Ms. Garbo, Mr. Burgess, and Senor Marquez may or may not have realized that this sentiment is so long held, it is considered foundational in the world of privacy. In 1890, Samuel Warren and future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis published a seminal piece in the Harvard Law Review that reduced the right to privacy to its core: the right to be let alone. Over the last 40 years, the ability to be let alone has come under increasing threat through technological advancements that facilitate digital surveillance and influence human psychology and behavior. Law is often several steps behind technology, but what we are currently experiencing is an influx of regulatory activity designed to rein in the power of companies to monetize our most personal of details: our locations, our health conditions, our sexual orientations, our marital and pregnancy statuses, our political affiliations, without our knowledge or consent. For hundreds, even thousands of years, human beings have debated where the private ends and the public begins. Today's congressional hearings on TikTok, for example, and their previous hearings on Facebook, European governments banning AI chatbots, and discussions on consent requirements for targeted advertising represent merely the next iteration of this fundamentally human question. The right to data privacy isn't going anywhere. As privacy, records management, legal, and security professionals, it is our responsibility to ensure that the organizations we work for understand this, and wherever we can, help them to embrace it. Thank you so much for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Hey, Bethany. So we have a question from Leslie, it looks like. Just put it there on the screen.
Do you think there is a willful ignorance at play by individuals, or is the average person just not aware of how much their information is being tracked? That is a fantastic question, Leslie. I really think that there is just a lack of awareness. I don't think it's necessarily a willful ignorance. Oh, maybe for some people. But I think the lack of awareness comes from deliberate practices on behalf of large companies. I think Facebook, Meta, is really a fantastic example of this. Um, and I think what we see with this is, you go into, I'm not on Facebook anymore, but back in the day I was, and you'd go into your privacy settings and you tried to update your privacy settings and you'd be told what you'd miss out on if you opted out of targeted ads, or if you made your thing, only friends or whatever. And so there's this idea that and it's not a bad thing, it's a common marketing tactic, right? You present the benefits of what it's for, and there is nothing inherently wrong with saying, hey, you're going to benefit from me having your data. What happens is you have kind of what's known in the industry as dark patterns, where you're sort of coerced into taking actions that you wouldn't normally take if you did have the complete picture. So like cookie banners that pop up on your screen, those annoying ones where you go to a website and you have to just click agree. Sometimes there's no deny button. Sometimes you have to go into settings to deny cookies. Sometimes you can't even get to the page unless you click accept. So there's this, what happens is you have companies that want to collect your data for various purposes, and they kind of put you into a path where it's just the easier thing to do. So with more debates around this, especially with some of the AI debates, there's I think a growing awareness of how data can be used and where some of the dangers are. But no, I don't think it's a willful ignorance. I think it's just there's so much out there and there's so many ways that we can be tracked. It's impossible to keep track of it all.
Looks like we don't have quite a question, but a comment certainly.
No questions, but an overwhelming amount of information you presented. Thank you, and I'm sorry. Not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing.
That was great. If anybody has any other questions, you can put it into the comments. We'll hold on for another minute just to see.
I definitely talked faster than I intended to, so that could be some of the overwhelming information. We're a little earlier than I anticipated during practicing, so I realized there's a lot there, and I went faster than I meant to do. So, yeah, a lot of things to think about.
No worries. Yeah, a lot of great content there.
Thank you.
All right,
yeah, we have plenty of time if there are any other questions or comments, discussion points.
Elizabeth is just saying that there's a lot to think about.
Yes, indeed. And honestly, like this was just so skimming the surface of these privacy topics. If you're interested actually in learning more about the history of privacy in the United States specifically, you should check out this book by Sarah Igo called The Known Citizen. So that one, I mean, that is the most well-resourced book I've ever seen. It's hundreds of pages of endnotes, but it's fantastic, and it really gives you a great sense of just history of privacy in modern America. It's fascinating if it's something you're interested in. And I think for records management professionals, it's interesting because the history of privacy is tied into records in the United States and a lot of laws. Do you expect a federal law to be passed regarding privacy? The states are certainly moving forward. So I don't know when. There have been a couple of laws that have been brought forth at the federal level. We got close last year, but it couldn't get passage in the Senate. There was a House bill, it didn't get passage in the Senate, or vice versa. There's one that was raised in 2019 or 2020 that just was reintroduced. So I don't know if it's going to happen within the next year or two. Eventually it will. My guess would be within the next 5 years. We are definitely seeing more movement from the states. And I think the more movement we see from the states, the more likely we are to see movement on the federal level, because companies, especially large companies, aren't going to want to comply with 50 different state laws. So it's going to happen eventually.
Have another comment.
Really informative and a great refresher for reactivating my CIPP US studies. Oh, thank you so much. Glad to hear that. Good luck on the exam.
And then it looks like Leslie included another.
Are there any apps you don't use due to their privacy settings? Well, I don't use Facebook. I don't use TikTok, but part of that is I'm too old for TikTok. But yeah, I mean, realistically, I use Google. So the internet has my data. My siblings and my friends are all on Instagram. So I'm on Instagram. So Meta has my data. I use LinkedIn, right? So realistically, it's really difficult to to reject a lot of the big tech apps, because it's pervasive. I mean, I use Amazon, but even if I didn't use Amazon.com for deliveries, the internet, so much of the internet is built on AWS. Amazon has the data, right? So it's really difficult to actually be in control of your data. I mean, Facebook, I stay away from, for obvious reasons, but and the newer ones like TikTok, I don't use, because it's new and I'm old and I don't need it. But I think that in general, if you are engaging with the modern world, it's almost impossible to not use apps that harvest your data in ways that you might not approve of. I think the thing to keep in mind is that they do have privacy settings. You can control those privacy settings. My Instagram is private. I have multi-factor authentication on every app I use, with long, complex, different passwords for everything. So you can engage in some kind of basic hygiene on these apps. But I mean, unless you're going to live in a cave, it's really hard to not engage with big tech.
Looks like we have a comment.
Yes. I don't know if I can type it into the chat. Is there a place I can type into chat?
If you send it to me, I can put it in the chat.
Okay, great. I'm going to type this in here. It's The Known Citizen, A History of Privacy in Modern America by Sarah Ego or Igo. I'm not sure how her last name is pronounced. I sent that to Matt in the chat, and so he can pop that in. Thank you, Matt.
Oh, here we go. Putting it up on the screen now.
It's a fantastic book.
And check it out. All right. Do we have any more questions? Doesn't look like it. I'm sorry. I'm going to put it back up there. Okay. And I guess we'll end it there. Thank you very much, Bethany, for talking with us today. I hope everybody enjoyed the session as much as I did. A special thank you to Archive 360 for sponsoring this session. There are 2 other sessions right after this, so please hop into those when you get a chance. Hope to see you all there.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate the engagement and your time. Thank you, Matt.
Have a good one.
A good one.